It begins not with a threat, but with a tidal wave of perfection. You are swept off your feet by a partner who seems to have memorized the very blueprint of your soul, showering you with grand gestures and declarations that you are the singular answer to their life's search. In the world of relationship psychology, this intoxicating phase is known as love bombing, and it is the most deceptive gateway into a toxic dynamic. To understand this mechanism, you must visualize the elegant, predatory nature of the Venus flytrap. The plant does not hunt. It simply exudes a sweet, irresistible nectar that draws its target in completely voluntarily. By the time the unsuspecting insect realizes the nectar is a lure, the jaws have already snapped shut and the digestion process has begun. In a toxic relationship, that sweet nectar is absolute, unyielding emotional validation. An emotional manipulator uses this hyperaffection not to authentically connect with you, but to rapidly dismantle your natural boundaries and bypass your critical thinking. They create an artificial sense of intimacy, so intense and fast-paced that you become entirely disoriented, confusing the rush of adrenaline for profound, destined love. You are systematically conditioned to rely on their constant praise, placing them at the absolute center of your emotional universe so that the trap can be primed. To see this dynamic play out on a legendary, devastating scale, we must examine the famously chaotic early courtship of literary icons F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. History often romanticizes them as the ultimate jazz-age tragic love story, a whirlwind romance fueled by champagne, creative genius, and undeniable passion. However, peeling back the gilded mythology of the 1920s reveals a deeply toxic foundation built on severe boundary violations and erratic emotional volatility. From the moment they met in 1918, Scott subjected Zelda to an overwhelming barrage of idolization, projecting his own desperate fantasies onto her rather than seeing her as a multidimensional human being. He did not just want to marry her. He wanted to consume her identity and mold her into the ultimate protagonist of his own life story. This relentless pursuit blurred the lines between romantic devotion and psychological consumption, establishing a dangerous precedent for their entire marriage. Scott famously lifted verbatim passages from Zelda's deeply personal diaries and letters, inserting her private, intimate thoughts into his published novels to construct his idealized character archetypes. This was not a partnership of equals. It was an emotional strip mining operation completely disguised as profound artistic collaboration. Zelda, in turn, engaged in her own forms of emotional manipulation, utilizing intense jealousy and erratic tests of devotion to maintain a chaotic grip on Scott's attention. Their early letters are not just passionate, they are suffocating, marked by a desperate, consuming need to possess one another entirely without regard for personal autonomy. This historical example perfectly illustrates the hallmark of the Venus flytrap dynamic. The overwhelming intensity of the connection is weaponized to justify the complete erasure of individual boundaries. When a relationship begins with such an explosive, all-consuming fervor, it leaves absolutely no room for the steady, safe development of genuine trust. Instead, the couple becomes locked in an escalating arms race of grand gestures, severe arguments, and dramatic reconciliations. They tragically mistake the sheer volume of their interpersonal drama for the depth of their love, blinding themselves to the toxicity taking route. Eventually, however, the intoxicating nectar of the love-bombing phase dries up, and the harsh reality of the trap becomes apparent. The flawless pedestal you were initially placed upon shatters, and the very quirks your partner once adored become the targets of their relentless attack. To understand the clinical mechanics of this insidious shift from idealization to devaluation, we must turn to the foundational research of Dr. John Gottman. After spending decades observing couples in his clinical love lab, Dr. Gottman identified 4 specific behaviors that predict relationship failure with terrifying accuracy, dubbing them the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. The very first of these horsemen to gallop into a toxic dynamic, signaling the end of the honeymoon phase, is criticism. It is absolutely vital to distinguish between a healthy relationship complaint and the destructive nature of toxic criticism. A complaint addresses a specific action or behavior, such as expressing frustration that your partner forgot to pay a utility bill on time. Criticism, however, is a weaponized, systemic attack on your partner's core character, identity, and worth. The toxic partner stops saying, "I am upset that you didn't call," and starts saying, "You never think about anyone but yourself because you are fundamentally a selfish person." This systemic nitpicking is designed to slowly chip away at your self-esteem, leaving you perpetually off balance and desperate to regain the flawless status you held during the love bombing phase. The criticism soon becomes a daily atmospheric condition, a slow drip of character assassination that makes you feel as though you can never do anything right. The partner who once claimed they loved your spontaneous nature suddenly despises your recklessness, and the person who praised your ambition now mocks your selfish career obsession. Dr. Gottman's clinical observations prove that this use of criticism is not merely a sign of a bad mood, but rather a structural mechanism of control. It utilizes absolute qualifiers like always and never to paint the victim into a psychological corner from which they cannot easily escape. When you inevitably attempt to defend yourself against these sweeping character attacks, the manipulator seamlessly deploys their most devastating psychological tool. Instead of addressing your hurt feelings or acknowledging the harshness of their words, they pivot to attacking your perception of reality itself. This marks the birth of gaslighting in the relationship ecosystem, a tactic designed to systematically dismantle your ability to trust your own senses, memory, and sanity. To decode the subtle, everyday language of this reality distortion, we must look to Dr. Robin Stern's seminal psychological work, The Gaslight Effect **. Dr. Stern's research reveals that gaslighting rarely begins with massive, cinematic lies. Instead, it starts as a series of micro-invalidations that slowly erode your cognitive confidence. When you confront the toxic partner about a cruel remark, they will look you dead in the eye and say, "I never said that, you are making things up," or "You are just being overly sensitive." These phrases are not mere defensive deflections. They are calculated, aggressive attempts to rewrite the historical record of your relationship. Dr. Stern identifies a deeply destructive dynamic she calls the gaslight tango, an active dance between the manipulator who needs to be right and the victim who desperately needs approval. The abuser capitalizes on your deep-seated desire to be understood, weaponizing your own empathy and willingness to compromise against you. By insisting that your reactions are disproportionate or entirely fabricated, they force you to expend all your energy defending your sanity rather than holding them accountable. Over time, you stop trusting your own internal compass, outsourcing your reality testing entirely to the person who is actively abusing you. The devastating synergy between Gottman's concept of criticism and Stern's framework of gaslighting is what truly snaps the jaws of the Venus flytrap completely shut. The constant criticism wounds you deeply, making you feel inadequate and unlovable, while the gaslighting ensures you blame yourself for those very wounds. You are caught in a psychological crossfire where you are simultaneously told that you are deeply flawed and that your perception of those insults is entirely wrong. This creates a profound state of cognitive dissonance, a mental paralysis where you can no longer distinguish between the loving partner who swept you off your feet and the cruel critic currently tearing you down. You find yourself endlessly analyzing the early days of the relationship, desperately trying to solve the puzzle of what you did to cause such a drastic shift. The tragic, hidden reality is that you did absolutely nothing to cause it. The shift was always the manipulator's intended destination. The grand gestures, the poetry, and the overwhelming attention were merely the sweet scent designed to lure you into a space where your boundaries could be safely dismantled. Now, stripped of your self-trust and isolated within a distorted reality of their making, you are perfectly positioned to be managed and contained. The brilliant disguise of the early courtship has vanished, leaving you trapped within a psychological cage that you willingly walked into. The trap is fully closed, the light of objective reality is blocked out, and the true, systemic mechanics of subjugation are ready to begin. With the psychological cage firmly locked in place, the dynamic shifts from emotional disorientation into the cold, calculated mechanics of total subjugation. This phase is not defined by explosive outbursts, but rather by the invisible, structural implementation of coercive control. The guiding metaphor for this terrifying escalation is the infamous phenomenon of the boiling frog. If you plunge a frog into a pot of boiling water, its survival instincts will instantly trigger, and it will immediately leap to safety. However, if you place that same frog in lukewarm water and incrementally turn up the heat, the creature will acclimate to the rising temperature until it is literally boiled alive. In a toxic relationship, the heat is turned up so gradually that the victim's internal alarm bells are deliberately bypassed. The escalation of restrictive behaviors rarely begins with a blatant demand to cut off your family or quit your job. Instead, it starts with a seemingly innocent, almost affectionate suggestion to skip a night out with friends because your partner simply wants you all to themselves. You view this as a romantic gesture of devotion, completely unaware that the temperature of the water has just increased by a single, imperceptible degree. Over time, these tiny concessions compound, systematically eroding your autonomy until the concept of independence feels entirely foreign. To understand the clinical architecture of this captivity, we must examine the groundbreaking sociological framework presented by Evan Stark in his seminal text, *Coercive Control: How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life. Stark revolutionized our understanding of toxic dynamics by arguing that severe abuse is fundamentally a liberty crime rather than merely an act of physical aggression. He posits that a toxic partner operates much like a hostage taker, utilizing isolation, intimidation, and control to strip away the basic human rights of their victim. This is a methodical, structural dismantling of your social, financial, and psychological independence, designed to make you completely reliant on the very person who is harming you. Stark's research reveals that this entrapment is achieved through the weaponization of everyday life. The abuser begins to dictate the micro-details of your existence, from the clothes you are allowed to wear to the amount of money you are permitted to spend at the grocery store. They monitor your communications, demand the passwords to your digital life, and interrogate you about your daily whereabouts with the relentless scrutiny of a prison warden. Because these tactics do not always leave visible bruises, the victim is often unable to articulate the profound danger they are in, trapped in a boiling pot that society still perceives as a perfectly warm bath. To witness the devastating reality of this structural entrapment on a historical stage, we must analyze the deeply tragic dynamic between legendary musicians Ike and Tina Turner. While their public persona was one of explosive musical synergy and unparalleled success, the private reality was a masterclass in coercive control. Ike did not merely want a talented partner. He demanded a total monopoly over Tina's identity, career, and basic human autonomy. He understood that to maintain absolute dominance over a star of her magnitude, he had to systematically sever every single lifeline she had to the outside world. Ike's campaign of control began with the methodical destruction of Tina's financial independence. Despite being the undeniable focal point of the act, Tina was entirely cut off from the economic fruits of her own labor. Ike controlled all the contracts, managed every bank account, and distributed only meager allowances, ensuring that she possessed no independent resources to fund an escape. By monopolizing her finances, he effectively transformed her immense talent into an instrument of her own captivity, proving that financial abuse is a cornerstone of coercive control that physically tethers the victim to the abuser. Beyond the financial strangulation, Ike ruthlessly targeted Tina's external support networks, recognizing that outside perspectives were a direct threat to his authority. He actively alienated her from family members, intimidated her friends, and fostered an environment of such intense volatility that others were simply too afraid to intervene. This extreme social isolation is a calculated tactic designed to make the abuser the sole arbiter of the victim's reality. When you are entirely severed from the people who love and support you, you lose the crucial sounding boards necessary to validate your suffering and recognize the toxicity. The final, most insidious layer of Ike's control was his absolute monopolization of Tina's very identity. He legally trademarked the name Tina Turner, a stage name he forced upon her without her consent, ensuring that if she ever attempted to leave, she would be leaving behind the very persona she had built. He dictated her stage presence, her wardrobe, and her grueling touring schedule, treating her not as a human being, but as a highly profitable, privately owned commodity. This level of total subjugation illustrates the terrifying endpoint of the boiling frog metaphor, where the water has reached a rolling boil and the victim realizes they are trapped in a cage of their partner's design. To fully comprehend the psychological engine driving this level of absolute micromanagement, we must integrate the clinical insights of Lundy Bancroft, outlined in his definitive work, Why Does He Do That? For decades, society operated under the misguided assumption that toxic and abusive behaviors were the result of anger management issues, childhood trauma, or a sudden loss of emotional control. Bancroft's extensive clinical work completely shatters this myth, revealing that toxicity is not a product of lost control, but rather a calculated strategy to maintain it. He exposes that the true root of this behavior lies in a deeply entrenched, highly distorted value system centered entirely around entitlement. Bancroft asserts that the toxic partner operates under the fundamental belief that they have a sovereign right to control you, your resources, and your movements. They do not view you as an autonomous individual with equal rights. Instead, they view you as an extension of themselves, a possession acquired to serve their specific needs. This profound sense of entitlement is what allows them to justify their restrictive behaviors without experiencing a single shred of guilt or remorse. When they demand you cancel your plans or hand over your paycheck, they are not acting out of a temporary emotional flare-up. They are simply enforcing what they genuinely believe to be their proprietary rights. This entitlement dictates that the abuser's needs, desires, and comfort must always supersede your basic human rights. If you attempt to assert a boundary, maintain a friendship, or express an independent thought, the toxic partner perceives it as a direct act of insubordination and an intolerable threat to their authority. Bancroft explains that their subsequent retaliation is not an uncontrollable rage, but a deliberate, punitive measure designed to crush your rebellion and restore their preferred hierarchy. They micromanage your life because their internal belief system dictates that you are simply incapable or unworthy of managing it yourself. The synthesis of Stark's structural framework and Lundy Bancroft's psychological insights reveals the true, horrifying nature of a toxic relationship. Coercive control is the cage, meticulously constructed through isolation and financial deprivation, while profound entitlement is the lock that keeps the door firmly shut. The toxic partner is not a damaged soul crying out for love. They are a warden enforcing a rigid, self-serving dictatorship within the confines of your personal life. They utilize the slow, steady heat of the boiling frog method to ensure that by the time you recognize the bars of your cage, you have been thoroughly stripped of the resources needed to break them. The mechanics of social isolation are particularly devastating in this modern context, often masquerading as intense devotion or protective care. The abuser may manufacture constant crises right before you are scheduled to see your family, forcing you to stay home and tend to their emotional needs. They might act so incredibly hostile or socially awkward around your friends that you simply stop inviting them over to avoid the inevitable conflict. Slowly, systematically, your social circle shrinks until your entire world is reduced to a single, claustrophobic point of contact. You are left marooned on an island of their making, completely dependent on the person who orchestrated your shipwreck. Financial captivity operates on a similarly insidious timeline, often disguised initially as a desire to take care of you or simplify your shared lives. The toxic partner may suggest that you quit your stressful job, offering to shoulder the financial burden so you can relax, effectively severing your primary source of independent income. They might slowly take over all the banking passwords, under the guise of handling the boring administrative tasks of the household. Before long, you find yourself having to ask for permission to buy basic necessities, entirely reliant on their approval for your very survival. This systematic dismantling of your autonomy creates a profound state of learned helplessness, where the sheer logistics of leaving feel infinitely more terrifying than the abuse itself. You look around and realize that the water is boiling, but your muscles have completely atrophied from years of forced immobility. You have no money to rent an apartment, no friends to call for a ride, and a deeply fractured sense of self that makes you doubt your ability to survive on your own. The toxic partner has successfully executed their master plan, transforming a vibrant, independent individual into a captive audience permanently tethered to their endless demands. While the conscious mind can be gaslit and conditioned into accepting these endless demands, the physical body cannot be permanently deceived. When the psychological burden of this captivity becomes too immense for the mind to carry, the trauma inevitably overflows into the physical vessel. This marks the ultimate breaking point of a toxic relationship, where the invisible, insidious wounds of coercive control begin to manifest as severe, undeniable physiological crises. You are no longer just fighting a mental battle. Your very biology is being hijacked and dismantled by the sheer weight of the ongoing abuse. To understand this terrifying biological rebellion, we must examine the groundbreaking psychiatric research of Dr. Bessel van der Kolk in his masterwork, The Body Keeps the Score*. Van der Kolk proves that trauma is not merely a cognitive memory stored in the filing cabinets of the brain, but a visceral, cellular experience locked deep within the autonomic nervous system. Long before your conscious mind is ready to accept the devastating reality of your partner's toxicity, your body will physically signal the presence of a lethal threat. You may begin to experience chronic migraines, sudden autoimmune flare-ups, unexplainable digestive issues, or a constant, vibrating state of sheer, unmanageable exhaustion. These severe physiological manifestations are your nervous system desperately pulling the internal fire alarm while your conscious brain insists there is no smoke. The toxic environment subjects you to a perpetual, daily flood of cortisol and adrenaline, keeping you trapped in a chronic, highly corrosive state of fight or flight. Over time, this relentless toxic stress actively destroys your immune system, transforming the emotional agony of the relationship into acute, somatic pain. Your physical form is quite literally collapsing under the immense weight of the cognitive dissonance, begging you to escape a danger that your mind is still desperately trying to rationalize and excuse. To visualize the agonizing psychological paradox of trying to leave this dynamic, we must employ the medical metaphor of the phantom limb. When a surgeon amputates a shattered, gangrenous limb to save a patient's life, the physical appendage is removed, but the brain's neurological map of that limb remains entirely intact. The patient continues to feel excruciating pain, itching, and cramping in a body part that is fundamentally dead, severed, and no longer attached to them. In a toxic relationship, the idealized version of your partner, the flawless, attentive soulmate from the initial love-bombing phase, is the phantom limb. You cognitively know that the relationship is profoundly destructive, a gangrenous emotional attachment that is slowly killing your spirit and destroying your health. Yet, your brain continues to fire desperate neurological signals, aching for the warmth, safety, and validation of a person who no longer exists, if they ever truly existed at all. You are constantly haunted by the ghost of the honeymoon phase, experiencing a painful, lingering psychological attachment that completely defies all logic and self-preservation. This phantom pain is the exact mechanism that drives victims back to their abusers time and time again, desperately trying to soothe a relentless ache in a space that is entirely hollow. To witness the devastating collision of this phantom, limb dynamic, and severe somatic pain, we must analyze the legendary, profoundly tumultuous marriage of artists Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. History frequently frames their bond through rose-colored glasses as a passionate, bohemian romance of twin artistic flames, but the historical reality was a harrowing portrait of chronic emotional betrayal. Rivera subjected Kahlo to relentless infidelity, chaotic separations, and deliberate psychological torment, fully aware of the profound emotional devastation his actions caused her. Their dynamic was a relentless pendulum swing between consuming devotion and catastrophic abandonment, creating a highly toxic environment that directly and visibly ravaged Kahlo's physical form. Kahlo already suffered from severe physical ailments due to childhood polio and a horrific bus accident, but the chronic emotional abuse inflicted by Rivera acted as a massive, undeniable amplifier for her somatic pain. Whenever Rivera's betrayals reached their peak, most notably during his devastating affair with Kahlo's own sister, Kahlo's physical deterioration violently accelerated. She endured countless spinal surgeries, agonizing physical braces, and extended periods of being entirely bedridden, her physical agony moving in dark, perfect synchronicity with her emotional heartbreak. Her iconic, visceral paintings of bleeding hearts and shattered spines were not merely surrealist art. They were literal, diagnostic records of a body absorbing the lethal toxicity of an inescapable trauma bond. The relationship of Kahlo and Rivera perfectly demonstrates that toxic love does not just break your heart. It actively dismantles your cellular biology and destroys your physical health. To comprehend the clinical mechanics of why someone would stay anchored to a partner, causing such profound physical and emotional deterioration, we must consult Dr. Patrick Carnes' definitive work, The Betrayal Bond Asterisk. Dr. Carnes maps out the terrifying biochemical reality of toxic relationships, proving conclusively that the victim is not staying out of weakness, but because they have been biochemically hijacked. He explains that the chaotic cycle of intense punishment followed by brief, dramatic reconciliations creates a highly addictive cocktail of neurochemicals within the brain. When the toxic partner attacks you, criticizes you, or threatens abandonment, your brain is flooded with cortisol, inducing a state of sheer panic and profound emotional pain. Then, when they suddenly pivot to apologize, offering a fleeting glimpse of the phantom limb, your brain is hit with a massive, overwhelming surge of dopamine and oxytocin. This extreme biochemical whiplash forges a trauma bond, a deeply ingrained physiological addiction to the cycle of abuse that is clinically identical to a severe substance abuse disorder. Your abuser has successfully positioned themselves as both the direct source of your agonizing withdrawal and the only perceived remedy for your pain. This harsh biochemical reality completely shatters the deeply insulting and ignorant societal question of, why didn't you just leave? Dr. Carnes illustrates that leaving a trauma bond requires enduring a brutal physiological withdrawal process that the conscious mind is entirely unprepared to face. The cognitive dissonance reaches its absolute peak in this stage. Your rational brain knows you are being destroyed, but your addicted nervous system screams that you will literally die without the abuser's validation. You find yourself caught in a devastating neurological loop, where the only way to temporarily stop the phantom limb from aching is to return to the very person wielding the knife. Breaking this biochemical cycle requires a radical, uncompromising shift in perspective, moving entirely away from romanticizing the struggle and toward recognizing it as a severe physiological hazard. You must accept the difficult truth that the intense, magnetic pull you feel toward your abuser is not a sign of profound, destined love, but the clinical symptom of a deeply entrenched trauma bond. True recovery begins the exact moment you stop trying to heal the phantom limb and start rehabilitating the core self that barely survived the amputation. It demands implementing absolute, non-negotiable distance, allowing your autonomic nervous system the necessary time to finally flush the addictive cocktail of cortisol and dopamine from your bloodstream. As the dense neurochemical fog slowly lifts, the body that meticulously kept the score will begin to regulate, and the severe physical manifestations of the toxic threat will gradually recede. The chronic fatigue will finally lift, the sharp mental clarity will return, and the sheer, exhausting weight of the cognitive dissonance will evaporate into the past. You will clearly realize that the love bombing was an illusion, the coercive control was a meticulously designed cage, and the trauma bond was a heavy chain, all constructed to consume your vibrant light. By trusting the desperate signals of your own body and understanding the clinical mechanics of the abuse, you reclaim the ultimate power: absolute sovereignty over your own reality, your own health, and your own life. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into the psychology and physiological reality of toxic relationships. If you found this information valuable and want to continue exploring the hidden mechanics of human behavior, psychology, and emotional healing, please make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep creating these comprehensive, research-backed videos, so hit that subscribe button, leave a comment below with your thoughts, and we will see you in the next video.